central part of my childhood. My mind jumps to fairy tales. I recall the primal awe I felt as Sleeping Beauty succumbed to a century-long slumber, just to awake, unchanged. I recall the seductive gingerbread house of Hansel and Gretel, how I looked at it at first with jealousy, then later with saccharine disgust. I feared Little Red Riding Hood's treacherous journey into the dark woods and thoroughly enjoyed the absurdity of the wolf's ultimate reveal. While I recognize that the themes in Sleeping Beauty are at times a subject of controversy, I continue to be enamored of this and many other tales' ability to transcend borders and stand the test of time. And looking back, my affection for these tales is not simply because of sentimentality. Its prominence in my memory is, I believe, due to the rawness and unflinching humanity they reveal. Facing this humanity requires a look into the original tales rather than the watered-down Disney versions. Perhaps we can examine this best by looking at the earliest recorded version of The Little Red Riding Hood, a story I hope you're all familiar with, particularly the note written by its author, Charles Perrault, at the end of the story. He writes, "From this story, one learns that children do very wrong to listen to strangers. And for not all wolves are of the same sort. There's one kind that is neither hateful nor angry, but tame and gentle, following the young maids into their homes." He then goes on to say that these gentle wolves are of all such creatures the most dangerous. So, looking at this tale, given this context, we see that this tale isn't merely an innocuous story of a little girl on her way to her grandmother's house. It's a grandmother's house. It is rather a more sinister allegory for sexual predation, more specifically rape, and how it isn't unusual for the perpetrators to seem benign at first glance. And given this context, we see that this tale isn't merely for children's entertainment. Neither is it the paragon of morality, the didactic lesson on how we ought to act. However, I offer the idea that fixating on morals ignores the very purpose of these stories. Additionally, viewing moral correctness as the sole purpose of these stories leads us into dangerous territory, one that confuses the magical logic of these fantastical worlds with the complexities of real life. There are numerous instances of this view being taken too far. This is one of them. In World War II, Nazis rewrote The Little Red Riding Hood, this time as a piece of propaganda. In their version, the Jew takes on the role of the nefarious wolf, while the German is the innocent Little Red Riding Hood. Some iterations even cast Hitler as the savior, the huntsman that rescues the little girl from an undeniable evil. By the end of the war, this version had helped to justify the suffering and deaths of millions of Jews during the Holocaust. Stories, when seen as absolute, are dangerously powerful. While an extreme example, this really aptly demonstrates that distorting these stories to fit a particular moral narrative is, at its core, a totalitarian mechanism. Doing so leaves little room for a nuanced, empathetic understanding of humans who cannot be so easily contorted into concrete literary boxes. Essentially, fairy tales fail as generalizations, and when viewed as such, they create a false sense of an unmoving reality. If fairy tales are lacking in this regard, then what is their purpose? I think they exist to be a portrait of humanity, one that breaks us down to our rawest constituents. By this, I don't literally mean our blood and bones, but our primordial emotions: love, grief, sorrow, elation, birth, death, departure, joy. Universally experienced wonders and perils of what makes us human are embedded within the fabric of fairy tales. Little Red Riding Hood is the story of innocence led astray. Hansel and Gretel shows us the worst of human temptation and greed. Sleeping Beauty grapples with death and overprotection. The purpose of these tales is not to be a manual on how to act, but to expose us to the heart of the human drive, stripped of historical developments, social constructs, or moral code. It is this that distinguishes fairy tales from any other modern story. It is this inherent quality that has enabled these fairy tales in particular, to endure through millennia. Unfortunately, this purpose is often forgotten when we view literature, where it holds a less obvious role. When the line between our world and the literary world thins, it becomes more and more ambiguous whether immorality in books should be punished as it would in life. We see this in the disquieting fiction novel, Lolita, authored by Vladimir Nabokov. For those not familiar, the 1955 novel is told from the perspective of a middle-aged man named Humbert Humbert. The book revolves around his infatuation with a young girl whom he calls Lolita, and is ripe with Humbert Humbert's sick desires. It's then no surprise that it's one of the most challenged novels of all time. It basically vocalizes the yearnings of a pedophile. Further, with Humbert Humbert's surgical manipulation of the written word and his clever, charismatic wit, he's confessional but never explicitly self-condemning. He instead charms the audience into sympathizing with him. This book is a criminal's justification for his actions. We may then be inclined to condemn the novel for its romantic depictions of pedophilia, painting a sexual predator as an eloquent writer of flowery prose, as a self-aware human being, seems to be a betrayal of the very moral values we seek to uphold. But this blame is misguided. Books only reveal the flaws that already exist within humanity. Lolita is not an endorsement of Humbert Humbert's actions, but rather a look into the disturbed and manipulative mind. Its ability to elicit such discomfort speaks more to the wrongness of the act it portrays than the morality of the book. Therefore, condemning and banning the novel is only a defense mechanism to avoid coming to terms with an issue in real life. Literature by itself is not morally regressive, but refusing to confront the issues they present is. When seriously considered, however, it can do the opposite. How so? In all our preconceived beliefs about the world, books are singularly illuminating. Well-written books are fluid and unable to be confined to a particular ideology. Endlessly interpretable, disturbing at times, and most of all, entertaining, their plots and characters ask us to probe and dig at our shortcomings and our blind spots, to see the limits of our own worldview. This is understandably an uncomfortable process. Sticking through with it, however, is wholly necessary. Because when we read and confront ourselves, we ignite change beyond the literary sphere. Reading is only the inciting event to the outbreak of something more infectious, discussion. Discussion, in particular, of silenced perspectives. Pages carry the voices of the oppressed, and in doing so, they're a direct blow to the systems that exist to keep them this way. Books fight the complacency that keeps our minds prisoner to ideological uniformity, and they fight our tendency to resist change. Discussing fiction is the place where we begin to push boundaries when real life refuses to bend. And eventually, the power of once upon a time will lead to tangible results. Whether it be by enacting new laws, toppling regimes, or eliminating systemic injustice. Such change will not come from agreeable, palatable books. It won't come from a sugar-coated saccharine representation of the world. It'll come first from confrontation with our rawest tendencies and deepest faults. I've always had this unanswered question in the back of my head of what literature is. Subconsciously, though, I was already aware of the answer. The visceral wonder I felt when feeling when hearing fairy tales as a child, the light that goes off in my head when reading and talking about good books. These moments lie in the profound capacity of books to address us, right at our core, and teach us what it means to be human. For this reason, it is crucial that we actively create a space for stories to thrive, that we condemn attempts to silence them and fight against the cowardice of censorship, be it through our own voices or through legislature. From the indelibly haunting tales we were told before bedtime, to the infinitely captivating narratives that get us voraciously flipping pages, fairy tales, literature, and more universally, stories should and must continue to be told. There is simply no other option. Thank you.